Welcome to AINdebrief, where we take a look back at the most important aviation stories of the past week by the AIN editors who covered them. I'm AINalerts editor Chad Trautvetter. In this week's episode, London-based editor Charles Alcock gives an overview of the latest WingX data, which indicates that business aviation flight activity is finally awakening from its COVID-19 induced slumber. Meanwhile, Washington, D.C.-based editor Kerry Lynch highlights the results from Bombardier's first quarter results and, unfortunately, layoffs at NBAA. I discuss layoffs at Gulfstream Aerospace and the bankruptcy filing at JetSuite. And editor-in-chief Matt Thurber concludes with Dair's delivery of the first 2020 TBM 940, which comes standard with the HomeSafe autoland system. Hi, Charlie. WingX put out some data on Thursday, and it looks like things are getting a little bit better for the business aviation, at least flight activity. So what do they have to say on the data?
Yes, just a few hours ago, data analytics group WingX released their latest global market tracker. And for the second time in a bit less than a week, there is somewhat encouraging news in that within their data, they have a 7-day average business aviation activity count. And it shows that since mid-April, overall, this is through today, May the 5th, that's actually improved by more than 40%. And as I say, data at the end of last week effectively confirmed that same trend. So it wasn't just a blip. But, before we get too carried away, we need to see this in relative terms. That's a 40% improvement on what had otherwise been a very negative trend in recent months. And the overall global business aviation activity picture released today shows that still overall activity is down by 68% for the period covering the whole of April and this first week of May. Now, that's slightly less bad than it was. It was way up above 70%. I think at this point, the business aviation sector needs to be thankful for almost any improvement, and that's not insignificant. Where it gets more interesting in a way is that WingX breaks it down, and it seems that at what we might call the lower end of the business aviation segment, the improvement is greater. So by that we mean light jets and turboprops. There's relatively higher levels of flying activity there. So reasons for being hopeful, but we're going to want to see that trend continue for a few more weeks.
So, but there's still a lot of lockdowns. What's the bigger picture on lockdowns? When do we expect countries to be more open to allowing business aircraft to fly there again?
Yes, that's another very important thing to watch. And not only watch what's happening with the lockdowns, but what the lifting of the lockdowns actually means for aviation. So over here in Europe, where I am, the UK, Germany, France, and Spain, and some other countries are now beginning to either lift their lockdown restrictions or announce that they're pretty close to lifting them. But what's significant is that so far, the governments concerned seem to have said almost nothing about what the lifting of those restrictions will mean for aviation and more specifically airline air transport. So in other words, they haven't yet ruled on things like, will airlines have to restrict access to the middle seat of 3 seats in a row? What sort of other limits might there be on the passenger load factors that are allowed on these aircraft? And really, until we have those details, it'll be hard for us to anticipate how the airlines may start to recover, and as a knock-on consequence, what might happen to business aviation. Because, of course, if it's very restricted in the airline world, arguably that might encourage people to turn to business aviation. But the fact is, we just don't know. And it sounds as if, the governments that we're talking about here have got plenty of other lockdown considerations on their mind before they even start getting into aviation.
It sounds like things are still unsettled. Is that right?
They're unsettled, but they're not quite as gloomy as they were even a few weeks ago.
Well, we'll take anything we can get, I guess.
Absolutely.
All right. So on Thursday morning, Bombardier released their first quarter results, and it wasn't a complete disaster. It was actually fairly decent. Right, Kerry?
So the results of Bombardier wasn't all bad news for the first quarter. Revenues increased because they are able to ramp up on their Global 7500, which is their flagship business jet. They delivered 6 in the quarter. And in fact, business jet deliveries overall increased in the quarter to 26. And that included one additional Global, which was probably from the 7500 family, but also one additional Learjet. The Challenger deliveries held steady in the quarter. In all, because they're delivering more 7500s, the business aircraft revenues were up 16% overall. However, the worst is yet to come for Bombardier. Sales dropped off precipitously beginning in the third month of the quarter in March and have been continuing. And this is particularly true with the light and mid segments. And because of this, and they've also had to halt production for several weeks as they readjust factories and try and quiet the pandemic. They're starting the restart now, but they said this is going to take all of second quarter just about to get it back to where they want it. And with the disruption in production and the drop off in deliveries, they are going to have to readjust their production and delivery expectations. Now, they're not saying right now what it will be because there's so many uncertainties around COVID that they can't really project for sure how much they can get to the end. They do think the Global 7500 line will fare better than the others because they have a very strong backlog. And overall, they said they're not getting very many cancellations. So they do think the Global 7500 production line will remain on target. However, how many will get delivered will be slightly adjusted because they had to slow production. So they're going to, in the end, be backed up a little there. And they do think that the second quarter is going to be a pretty bad quarter. They called it a low point because, they're still just getting production ramped back up. The sales have slowed. Deliveries, there have been a few deliveries that have shifted or been on hold because they can't meet up with the customers. And so right now it's just a lot of uncertainty for them.
Yeah, they also addressed the previous downturns with this one. What do they say about this one that's different than the other downturns?
Well, the biggest difference is they're not seeing a rush of cancellations, which, that was what all the manufacturers had faced at the time. The other thing is the Learjet program has kind of slowed for them in shifting their reliance even more so on the large jet segment. And they think they're pretty well buffered with their order book with the large jet segment, which also includes the globals by the global 5,500, 6,500, and maybe some residual 5,000, 6,000s.
Interesting. All right, so let's shift over. There was some news from NBAA this week. It wasn't great news, but it's news nonetheless. So what did NBAA have to say this week?
Oh, well, the past couple of weeks overall, Chad, have been very difficult in the layoff front. Just this week we saw news from GE Aviation. There was some news out of Rolls-Royce where thousands of workers are now getting laid off. And NBAA is not immune to that. Now, of course, they don't have thousands of workers, but they're being hit as well. And so they took a rare step. You don't often see associations, and particularly NBAA, layoff, but they did take a rare step to lay off workers. I believe it's throughout the association. They didn't give a number or say who, but they said the number is significant. And what's hitting NBAA in particular are the need to cancel a lot of events. And the events tend to be a revenue driver for the association. They've already lost eBase. They had to cancel ABase. There's numerous conferences from maintenance to the international operators. Now, some of these have moved online, but you can't make the money online that you do in person. And so, it's a tough time for NBAA. And, it's not just NBAA, it's a lot of associations. EAA just a week ago had to face the difficult decision of canceling their hallmark event, Oshkosh, in July. And I'm sure that's going to be a tremendous hit to the association.
So that wasn't the only layoffs this week. So I'm going to throw the microphone over to Charlie here, and he can ask me about Gulfstream.
Yes, Chad. So, of course, we've all been tracking company results. I gather, this week tuned into what Gulfstream had to say, and it sounds like, unfortunately, the news was more than just temporary furloughs. It sounds like, a fairly significant right sizing, as they like to call it, in response to the current crisis. What happened there?
Well, yeah, it is a right sizing. It doesn't seem like it's just temporary. It seems like these are more permanent. They are layoffs, but they're more permanent reductions. As everybody sees, an uncertain future in the post-COVID era. So what they said this week is that the cost-cutting measures they took earlier that they thought would help stem any losses from the pandemic weren't enough, and they had to go further. So what they said is they had to balance the size and structure of the business with current conditions. And part of that, they had to make layoffs, and they've also made a decision to close the Las Vegas service center. So we don't have any numbers, but the Savannah news organizations said that just in Savannah alone, there's probably about 700 layoffs there. And there's about 150 people who work at the Las Vegas center. So, it's pretty significant. We could be talking thousands worldwide. I think Gulfstream employees, I don't know the number off the top of my head, but it's well above 20,000 people. So this is a pretty significant cut for them.
It is, and of course, we've often viewed Gulfstream as one of the more stable long-term players in this sector, so it's all the more significant. And I gather there's other evidence of some casualties in the industry. Probably the largest operator so far that we've seen in serious trouble. Tell us about what's happened at JetSuite.
Yeah, JetSuite filed for bankruptcy late last week. And they're one of the larger they're not that large of a charter operator, I guess, but they're one of the more well-known. They were started by the founder of JetBlue Airlines, David Neeleman. So, they've got a lot of press. They only had a fleet of about a dozen airplanes or so, mostly phenoms. But the bankruptcy filing is pretty significant. Their creditors are owed between $50 and $100 million, and they're saying they only have less than $10 million on hand. So, and many of those creditors are basically jet card customers where they have money in account that they would use to fly.
Yeah, and that seems quite worrying to me, because that implies that, if you had quite a lot on credit with them under a jet card, does that imply those people might not necessarily get their money back?
If they get anything back, it's going to be pennies on the dollar. The biggest creditor actually, and this was a jet card customer, is Netflix. They had about $930,000 in the account. On the top 30 list, 28 were jet card holders. Only Textron Aviation, for their service center for maintenance, they were the only non-jet card holders on that list. But there's a long list of creditors. There's probably, I think, between 100 and 200 creditors. And from what I understand, most are jet card holders. They have about 50 or 60,000 in there. But there's some that have, significantly more, like Netflix. And there's other customers who have in a $250,000 and $300,000 range, which is pretty significant.
Yeah. Not to labor this, but do you think that could be discouraging for consumers of jet cards going forward, that they perhaps would look at that and say, I'm not going to commit significant sums of money ahead of time unless I know for sure that money is held in some sort of escrow account? Yeah,
I think that's a good point. Customers, I think, are going to be more wary of where their money's sitting, and they're going to look for operators who hold their money in escrow versus just into a regular bank account. Just because once burned, you don't want to do it again, and you see this happening to other people, you don't want it to happen to yourself. And there are services out there that will escrow money. Customers should be more wary of where their money's sitting. There are operators out there who are trying to mitigate this. One of them is Fly Exclusive, and they're offering basically a discounted jet card. Their $150,000 jet card is being discounted $50,000 for people who were JetSuite customers, because they want to reduce the black eye to the industry. So they're just trying to help those people out.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Thanks for explaining that, Chad.
Yep. So let's hop over to Matt. Matt was on the Daer press call by webinar on Wednesday morning. So they had some good things to say. So they're delivering their first 2020 TBM 940. So what does that mean, Matt?
Thanks, Chad. And it's nice to see some good news for a change in this industry. But Daher yesterday delivered the first 2020 TBM 940 to a customer in California. And what's interesting about the 940 model is not only that it has an auto throttle, but it's also equipped with Daher's HomeSafe autoland system. Now, autoland isn't certified yet, so it's not actually switched on in this particular airplane, but it will be when certification happens in June or possibly early July. And autoland is a Garmin-developed technology that allows anybody in the aircraft to push a button in case the pilot becomes incapacitated. And the airplane basically looks for the nearest suitable airport and lands itself.
Well, it does more than just land itself. It announces its position. It also works a lot of the aircraft systems. It's very integrated, right? It's almost at that point, it's almost a fully autonomous aircraft, right?
Absolutely, Chad. Autoland has fairly sophisticated algorithms that look at a lot of variables to pick the best airport, considering the available fuel, the fuel flow, the winds, weather, runway length, etc. And once the passenger pushes the autoland button, that's it. They just sit back and go along for the ride. The airplane does everything. It slows down, descends to the correct altitude, flies to the runway, puts down flaps and landing gear, lands on the runway, brakes, stops, and then after stopping, it shuts off the engine so there's no possible harm to the passengers. And the final step is it'll instruct them on how to open the door to get out of the airplane.
It even does nose wheel steering too, right?
Yes, absolutely. It takes over whatever it needs to get the airplane safely onto the ground and basically lined up with the center line of the runway, including nose wheel steering. It doesn't taxi off the runway, but this is an emergency situation, so that's not really necessary.
But just the certification of this amount of automation is significant, right?
Absolutely. In fact, there's other manufacturers that are putting autoland into their aircraft. Piper was the first actually in the M600. Cirrus is putting it in the Vision jet. And certification was expected earlier, but the coronavirus pandemic has slowed down certification activities, obviously. But it's a big step to ask the regulator to certify something like this, which has never been done before. But all indications are that certification, both with the FAA and EASA, will be coming shortly.
Yeah, and this certification is kind of a baby step towards more fully autonomous systems, right?
Autoland is a lot more than just an autopilot add-on. It's very near an autonomous airplane, and it probably wouldn't be a very big step to go beyond autoland into more autonomy. But I imagine the engineers at Garmin are already thinking about these kind of things.
All right, cool. Thanks, Matt. Thanks for listening to AINdebrief. Another podcast episode will air next Friday. In the meantime, go to www.ainonline.com for the latest aviation news from AIN.